Over to you, Jeff.
Let's begin with some auspicious verses of salutation from Nagarjuna's fundamental treatise on the middle. Enthused by great compassion, you taught the immaculate Dharma to abandon all views. To you, the Buddha, Gautama, I pay homage. Over to you, Professor Weinberger.
Thank you, Jeff. Can everybody hear me okay? We did a check, but just making sure. Okay, great. So we're going to start a little differently today. Before Jeff's introduction, if you can stand up if you are able and willing. If you cannot, you can stay in your seats, or if you're lying down, that's also fine. We're going to do a little practice to kind of arrive here and settle a little bit, and it's just jiggling. So just the soft knees, feet flat, about shoulder width apart, just gently bouncing up and down. And if you'd like to, you can bring your attention to the soles of your feet in contact with the floor. Just gently bouncing or jiggling. And your feet sink into the floor or sink into the seat. If you're sitting, or sink into the bed. If you're lying down. If you're sitting, you may want to gently rock forward and backwards, left and right. If you're lying down, you may try gently rocking to the left and right. Just letting the body move in small movements. When you feel ready, letting the body come to a still point. And if you're standing, taking your seat again. And now back to you, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Professor Weinberger. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 11th and final installment of the Jeffrey Hopkins Legacy Series with Professor Stephen Weinberger. My name is Jeff Allen, and I'm honored to be here on behalf of Buddhist Center, again, collaborating with Sravasti Abbey and Institute for Tibetan Studies. Any donations received during this series will go to Institute for Tibetan Studies. There will be a link in the chat box as usual for donations. This will bring you to the Sravasti Abbey donation page. Right in the comments section, when you make your donation, Jeffrey Hopkins series, and this will help to continue make the internet availability of so many publications on the website, as well as providing funding for future translations. Professor Hopkins left because of impermanence, quite a few unfinished projects, and he worked on translation and gave teachings right up until the end of his life. As you know, the updated meditation on emptiness will be out at the beginning of 2025. I think I said 24 last time. Wisdom Publications has generously offered a 30% discount on the new hardcover version to all participants in the Legacy series. The code will be good until December 31st of this year. which is 2024. And you will find it in the link and the code in the chat box. And the code is MOE, lowercase MOE, and then the number 30. So when you go to the link that brings you to the book, you put in that when you go to checkout, there'll be a place for code. You put that in and it'll offer you a 30% discount. And as a side note, the new cover on this edition is a picture of Chandrakirti, and it's a tanka painted by the very famous painter, again, Sanjay Yeshe. So just show you a picture of the new cover of Meditation on Emptiness. It's a beautiful tanka. Again, Sanjay Yeshe was an extremely famous tanka painter. And this is a tanka that hung and probably still hangs over Gen Jeffrey's desk at UMA in Virginia. And when we decided, or when Genla decided he wanted to change the image on the cover, he was trying to figure out how to get the photo of the Chandrakirti image. And he said, wait a second, I know. And he immediately said, I'll call Stephen because he knows how to do things right. So not only is he a magnificent scholar, he's obviously a wonderful photographer as well, because he took the beautiful picture of the tanka that you see on the front of this book that's coming out in 2025. Just as an aside, for fun. After the lecture, we'll entertain a few questions for around 30 minutes. Please post those in the link found also in the chat box. We'll get to as many as we possibly can, and slides will be made available after the teaching. It's my honor to introduce you to Professor Stephen Weinberger, Vice President of UMA Institute for Tibetan Studies. Professor Weinberger earned his bachelor's degree from Amherst College and then went on to University of Virginia, where under the advisement of Professor Jeffrey Hopkins earned his PhD in 2003. His PhD thesis was entitled The Significance of Yoga Tantra and the Compendium of Principles within Tantric Buddhism in India and Tibet. He was considered by Professor Hopkins to be one of the most knowledgeable individuals about this topic. At the beginning of Lama Tsongkhapa's Great Exposition of Secret Mantra, Volume 3, Yoga Tantra, many of you have, I have the old one. It has a new fancier cover with the new title, but this is the third volume. So in that third volume, you see at the very beginning where Professor Hopkins writes, I deeply appreciate input from Dr. Stephen N. Weinberger, whose expertise gained from writing his doctoral thesis on Yoga Tantra proved invaluable in bringing this book to conclusion. Dr. Weinberger was the last of the students to live at UMA while studying with Gen Hopkins in the UVA program. He heard Ganden Shartse Geshe Gonchu Sering was coming and wanted to have as much time with him as possible. Emptiness took no summers off. He read texts with Professor Hopkins week after week and was completely immersed in studies. Professor Weinberger's translation works, such as the topography of the Tibetan intellectual world and how to debate it, Ngawon Tashi's The Collected Topics of Epistemology, Volume 1, Chapters 1 through 12, can be found on the UMA website. Here, you will find out how to help out that friend that Craig Preston was talking about that thinks all colors are red. Maybe ask about the color of white religious conch shell or something to see if that helps. You can also learn that all phenomena are not impermanent because permanent phenomena can be established by valid cognition. He also did oral translation for Losaling Geshe Jambil Tardo, resident Lama of Jefferson Tibetan Society in Charlottesville, and translated in the 2000s in Charlottesville for Jonan Kempo Ngawon Dorje. Professor Weinberger taught Tibetan language at University of Virginia for many years. He also managed the Tibetan and Himalayan Library for decades. This is a huge online multimedia guide and digital library hosted by UVA, another resource that is a treasure trove of information. It's like walking into a Himalayan learning center with a rare books library and a huge museum attached that's always having new wings and exhibits added. Professor David Germano has been instrumental in keeping this going as well. Professor Weinberger is interested in the practice of meditation and in particularly the psychological and neurological understanding and effects of meditation. He also practices craniosacral therapy. Professor Hopkins thought you were a great representative of the tradition because you are an intellectual and approach the therapy with a scientific mind and not the woo-woo thinking, quote unquote. He insisted that Lori and I meet you when we visited UMA in June, and we talked for hours, and it was absolutely delightful. Your wisdom is very deep The energy systems within the body are subtle. This is what we learn in Tantra. If these systems can be tapped into for health corrections, why would we not explore them? As vice president of UMA, he will, alongside UMA president Elizabeth Napper and fellow board members, bring this incredible organization into the future for the first time without Professor Jeffrey Hopkins in the driver's seat. Genla is so lucky to have people like you to pass the flaming sword of wisdom to. With excitement, I'm honored to introduce you to the final speaker of the Jeffrey Hopkins Legacy Series, Professor Stephen Weinberger, to tell us all about the importance of Yoga Tantra and introduction to the Sarva-tathagata-tattva-samgraha. Over to you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you so much for that overly kind introduction. I'd also like to thank Jeff for organizing this series of talks. I found it really both instructional and inspirational. And I'd like to thank Sravasti Abbey as well for hosting and sponsoring this. And on a personal note, a longtime member of Sravasti Abbey and I are actually cousins, Paya Rostholder, who formerly went by Lori Rostholder. So personally, it's nice to connect with Sravasti. And Paya and I connected a few months ago after she saw the announcement for this talk series. So thank you all. And I hope the little exercise at the beginning helped everyone kind of arrive and settle a bit. Just a way to kind of separate from the rest of the day and come into this space for today's talk. I'm going to start hopefully with a fairly short part about my relationship with Jeffrey and what I have learned from him, some of the many things. And I want to kind of make a disclaimer to begin. I've been working on this for some time. I don't do public speaking very often. I almost never do PowerPoint presentations. So there's a slow learning curve or a steep learning curve for that. But also I ask for your kind of patience if there are places where it's choppy. And I will say that when I did a run through of this first part yesterday, just about kind of my personal relationship with Jeffrey, it was like 30 minutes and even I was bored by it. I bored myself. So I tried to edit it down some and hopefully it will be illuminative about aspects of Jeffrey that maybe people are not familiar with. Okay. So how did I get to the University of Virginia and how did I come to study with Jeffrey? I started as an undergraduate student at Amherst College and for a variety of kind of random seeming reasons, took class with Bob Thurman, as people often did back then. And it was his Buddhist philosophy class, so I got an introduction to Buddhist philosophy and I was quite interested, but it was the end of the third year of college and too late to change majors. And the next year, Bob, who students affectionately called Buddha Bob at the time, was on leave, so there were no more classes to take with Bob. I did study the next year in the spring. I learned the Tibetan alphabet and how to pronounce syllables and things like that with Bob's student at the time, John Dunn, who has gone on to his own renowned career in Tibetan and Buddhist studies. And after I graduated from college, I did Antioch College's Buddhist Studies program in India, which was a one-semester program in Bodh Gaya. On that program, I studied Tibetan language, spoken Tibetan with the late Dan Perdue, who was a student of Jeffrey's, and who wrote, as Venerable Chudra-in-law said in her talk, wrote the Big Thick Debate book. Also, as part of the Antioch program, there was one of the required classes was the meditation practicum. And so we did 3 weeks of Vipassana with Munindraji, who was one of the main teachers of the kind of first American generation of Vipassana teachers like Joseph Goldstein and Sharon Salzberg. We did 3 weeks, but only 8 days in person with Chikanima Rinpoche from Nepal. And we did 3 weeks of Zazen with a Zen monk who was resident at the Zen temple in Bodh Gaya. And I had some interesting experiences during some of those meditations, and it was enough combined with my interest in philosophy, which Bob Thurman had kind of stoked already, to just kind of form an internal commitment to want to continue to study and practice Tibetan Buddhism in particular, but Buddhism in general. And in discussing that with Dan Perdue, he happened to mention that Geshe Wangyal Center in the wilds of northwestern New Jersey was possibly a place where I might continue to study and practice after I left India. And after that semester program ended, I also attended teachings by the Dalai Lama for the first time. At that time, I think every year he did annual teachings in Bodh Gaya in January. And then I went overland from Nepal to Tibet. This was in February of 1987. And Tibet had just opened to tourism, I think the year before, or maybe a little bit before that, but pretty recently. And so there was just public transportation, and in the middle of winter, that can be a little less than ideal. It was Tibetan New Year, and so they had the Munlam Chenmo, the Great Prayer Festival in Lhasa for the first time since sometime during the Cultural Revolution, when it had been prohibited. So it was a kind of vibrant time in Lhasa. On the way back, I organized a kind of tour because there was one company that had 2 Japanese-made minibuses that seated about 22 people. And if somebody organized a tour and collected money, they would go to the border and stop where you wanted them to. And I guess my Tibetan language skills were good enough. The Tibetan driver only spoke Tibetan, and people in hotels only spoke Tibetan. And so I was responsible for making all those arrangements and doing all that kind of communications. I think of that as kind of being an accidental tour guide. In any case, I came back to America. Eventually, I went to Geshe Wangyal Center in New Jersey. Geshe had passed away several years before. I lived there for about 5 months. During that time, Loseling, Drepung Loseling monastic colleges, one of their retired abbots, Yeshe Tupten, was living there and teaching. So I spent time with him. And he was one of the teachers that John Powers mentioned that he had studied with. And also Anne Klein studied with Yeshe Tupten. He was, I think, the only source, but at least the main source for her Path to the Middle Oral Madhyamaka philosophy book. And so I spent some time there before I came to Virginia to kind of see what was going on there with Jeffrey. And so by the time I went to Virginia, I had studied in India. I had traveled to Nepal. I had spent about 3 or 4 weeks in Tibet. I had learned some spoken Tibetan, and I had done some meditation. So in addition to this study with Bob Thurman. And so that was kind of the place I was in when I arrived in Charlottesville. And I started there as an unenrolled graduate student, which I'm pretty sure the university would not approve of then, and I think it would be impossible to do now, but Jeffrey used to let people do that. And so I did a semester that way, and then I applied and entered the graduate program. And as Jeff said, after I'd been there for a year, I moved to Uma, to Jeffrey's place, because Geshe Gunchok Tsering was coming, and I wanted to spend, and he was going to stay there, and I wanted to spend more time with him. And that tradition of students living with Jeffrey and Tibetan teachers actually started when Jeffrey was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin with his mentor, Richard Robinson, So there was a long tradition of that, although I was, I think, the last in that line. And Jeffrey and I started reading, I think after I'd been there about a year. As Don Lopez and others have said, he assigned topics. He did not assign me a Jamyang Sheba Gomong monastic curriculum text. He assigned me a yoga text, a yoga tantra text. And we actually worked on several texts. We read a lot together. There were weekly readings of just as Jeff said. And as Guy Newland said, there was a real intimacy in these meetings, meeting one-on-one with Jeffrey to read. And I've been thinking a lot about how to articulate that, and I don't really know how to do it. Part of it was the focus, because Jeffrey is extremely focused, and it was a very kind of intense hour and a half. I think Jeffrey also thought of it as a kind of special time, because once he said to me, my family doesn't know who I am, but this is who I am, meaning when I'm here reading texts. And I think it was, a core part of who Jeffrey was. And certainly for me, I feel like it's a core part of who I was and am. I just live a very texty life inside my head. And so this fit in quite nicely with that. And in the reading sessions, Jeffrey really wanted you to learn how to do it so that you could do it yourself. And so in that way, he was really, I found, very generous. Generous with his knowledge. Some people can be kind of stingy, but with their knowledge. But I found Jeffrey to be very generous. And he taught you how do you read texts and how do you do research. And he taught you the way that he did it. One other thing that I found, and I don't know if other students had this experience, I don't know that anyone's talked about it, is that when we read, I found we were really reading as two Buddhists. Not to say that we had kind of suspended academic, a kind of critical academic eye. We still had that, but there's just something kind of underlying it that I felt we both understood. We were personally invested in this, and that's why we were doing it, even though it was within an academic institution. And occasionally Jeffrey would get up and close the door to his office and say something personal. And I was trying to think of what the things were that he said. And I think one of the things he said was, got up and shut the door, and he said, well, so I had this dream where I was floating inside this temple and running my hand along the place at the top of the wall where it met with the ceiling, and that this was his monastery from his previous life. He never identified what the actual monastery was, but he shared this kind of experience with me. And so there were sometimes those kinds of interchanges, at least in the sessions, the reading sessions I had with Jeffrey, which just added to the richness of the experience and the relationship. Okay. One other thing I want to talk about is working for Jeffrey. The first summer I lived in Charlottesville, he hired me to do input, and this was 1998 when not very many people were doing input of Tibetan texts. So I typed in the Leksha Ningbo, Tsongkhapa's Essence of Eloquence, and then proofread it. And then I also typed into, I think, a FileMaker Pro database for any of you kind of techies who go way back. Typed in all of his Tibetan books to create like a database. And so, although I didn't know it at the time, this was kind of the beginning of my career in digital Tibetan work. And as Jeff mentioned, I have worked for the Tibetan and Himalayan Library for 20-something years. And so Jeffrey kind of set me on that path, for better or for worse. I think mostly for better. And the other kind of piece of work I did for Jeffrey was proofreading things. And he asked me to proofread the um, fluent Tibetan, spoken Tibetan book. And I guess because I had found some errors and made a few corrections here or there, he decided he would include me as a collaborator on the book, list me on the title page as a collaborator, which is also, I found, very generous. And after that, I proofread a number of books for Jeffrey. I don't remember how many. I think maybe the first was the Dalai Lama, The Meaning of Life, A Buddhist Perspective. And the last book, as Jeff mentioned, was the Yoga Tantra book. When I was working on that book, I found it sort of funny. He said, well, I'm going to put you and Kevin Vos, who had also edited that book, as co-editors of this book, because I've realized that if you're the author, you don't list yourself as editor. That's just part of the process of authorship. And so that he said he should have been listing or crediting people who had worked on his books as kind of proofreaders, as editors. So I think now all of you former students of Jeffrey who worked on his books and got a mention in the acknowledgments, but not on the cover as editor, you can update your CVs to say you're editor. Okay. And also, though I didn't know it at the time, this kind of detail-oriented and text and language work was kind of a forerunner to much of the work I would do for the Tibetan Himalayan Library, where I've done a lot of content proofreading, as well as basically being the quality assurance department for software development. And so again, Jeffrey gave me my start in that, for better or for worse, but I think mostly for better. So I'll try to speed up a little bit here. I think I don't want to bore you too much. It may sound like it was all work and no play, but in fact it was not. And I think some of you may be surprised to learn that one summer, Jeffrey and I actually played squash together several times. It was a kind of semi-regular squash game that we had. And I had played a lot of racket sports and had just done a racquetball gym class, so my racket skills were fairly good. And so in the game, when it would get to the point where I was about to win, he would say, Dakshen Yamje. Now, for all of you who don't speak Tibetan, literally that's equalizing and switching of self and other, but it's also one of the two practices to develop compassion and the intention to become enlightened for the benefit of all beings. And so when Jeffrey said Dakshen Yamje, equalizing and switching of self and other, we would switch points, and now he would be at the point where he was about to win, and I would be behind and have to try to catch up. Okay. One other thing that I want to mention is that Jeffrey conceived and organized a conference at the University of Virginia in 1988 for 9 Nobel Peace Laureates, including the Dalai Lama. And he asked me kindly to be the escort for the Dalai Lama's entourage, and also to be the liaison to the State Department security team who was doing security for the Dalai Lama, I think for the first time on that trip. And so at the very end, just before the Dalai Lama left, there was a very short audience for Brian Phillips, who was a graduate student who had taken either 1 or 2 semesters off to actually do the kind of nuts and bolts daily work to organize it. And so I got to tag along, and when the Dalai Lama came in, he said to me, "Oh, you're the Yoga Tantra guy, right?" Because I had an audience with him 4 years before to talk about asking some questions. And I said, yes. And he said, "Are you reading Shakyamitra's text?" And I said, no. And then it went on, and the 3 minutes were up, and he left to go to the airport. And I mentioned to Jeffrey immediately afterwards, and he said, "Steve, he's telling you to read the text." So, which I would not have gotten from that interaction. Now that summer I had spent in Tibet in 1998, about 3 months, and it was the second time I had been, and that included 8 days in a Geshet Sogyo cave at a Padmasambhava site called Emalung or Yamalung. And so perhaps the timing was right, and it was, I was now ready to get the instruction to read this text, or perhaps I'm just wandering over the line between being optimistic and optimistical. But in any case, Jeffrey clarified for me what he thought the Dalai Lama meant. I also traveled in 2006 to Japan to receive Yoga Tantra initiations from the Dalai Lama, and Jeffrey was serving as a consultant for a small, mini Nobel laureates conference that was associated with it. And so he said, "Oh, you can just stay in my hotel room. They're paying for it, so you can stay here." So we spent several days traveling together in Japan. And then the last kind of work that I did for Jeffrey, or with Jeffrey, which Jeff mentioned, was after the late Dan Perdue had passed away. Jeffrey asked me if I would like to work on the collected topics text from the Gomong curriculum. And so I did that, and as Jeff said, published one book on the first part of that text. Okay. I visited him once in Vancouver sometime in the 2000s. And at some point in the 2000s, we had a conversation about some experiences I had had, kind of meditation-like experiences. And afterwards, he said, "Well, I'm glad we had this conversation. I've been wanting to have this conversation with you for a while," which was a bit of a surprise to me. And I don't say any of these things to make any claims for myself, but just that there were other sides to Jeffrey that I think maybe have not come out in these talks, and it seems a little bit important. It seems important just to bring those out. And one thing, and this also follows on the Venerable Children-in-law's talk, she mentioned that they had invited Jeffrey after he had come out as gay to their center in Seattle because they had several gay members. And I think this is an important thing to talk about because it did seem to be a big part of Jeffrey's identity. And after he came out, it was always important to him to present himself as a gay man. I happened to be living at Uma when he came out. And so I was one of the first people that he came out to, and perhaps some of the kind of closeness in our relationship maybe stems from that. I don't know, the closeness I feel maybe stemmed from that because it was a difficult time for him. And when he told me, I said, okay, and didn't really think about it again because I had to go back and study Sanskrit and get prepared for class. So, and I will say, and I say this, Don Lopez said when they were students, everyone was kind of afraid of Jeffrey. And he also said that Jeffrey just said what he thought. And I think he told a story about Jeffrey was telling him something and Don was nodding, and Jeffrey stopped and said, "Do you already know what I'm saying?" And Don said no. And he said, "Well, then stop nodding like you do." So that he was very direct. Because when he came to tell me that he was gay after his first boyfriend had come to visit for the weekend, which I thought nothing about, he said, "Well, you can tell and he just couldn't get the words out to say, "I'm gay." And so it was the only time that certainly I ever saw him not be able to say directly what he was saying. And I mentioned this to, I think, emphasize how important this was for Jeffrey and how big of a deal it was for a man born in 1940 to come out. And to me, after Jeffrey came out, over time, he became a much softer and warmer person and a much more human person. And so that's why I think it's important for me to talk about them. And then the last maybe 10 years, our relationship kind of evolved from strictly mentor-mentee to kind of more friends. And when he would come to Charlottesville, he would get in touch and we would have a meal together. And sometimes we would just talk about whatever work was going on. But sometimes it would be more personal conversations. And I remember one conversation, he was talking about when his mother had passed away. He was on tour with the Dalai Lama. And so the Dalai Lama had found out and got in the car and said something like, well, we're just like leaves in autumn that blow together and then disperse. And Jeffrey said, wow, that was just the perfect thing. And it was very significant to him. And as Jeffrey was telling me this, he was crying. And I don't think I'm betraying any confidences by saying this now. And so for me, this was just part of Jeffrey becoming a kind of warmer, a warmer person. And so that's why I mention it here. Yeah, okay. The last thing that I want to say is kind of personal remarks, and I'll try to be very brief. And I think this is also important because it was kind of part of Jeffrey's personality. Don Lopez did mention that they were afraid of him, and I think Jongbok mentioned Jeffrey's kind of wrathful activity. By the time I got to study with Jeffrey, I think he had mellowed a lot, at least what I gathered from previous students. But there were still some occasions, either involving myself or other students, that were kind of similar to the stories I had heard. And for me, for all of Jeffrey's really many wonderful qualities, and I hope that that's come through in what I've said, he was a person who was sometimes, frankly, cranky and short-tempered. And I bring this up not to criticize Jeffrey, but I think the common thread of these talks has been Buddhist view or views of reality. And I think Dan Kozort's talk about how we humans see ourselves in our place in the world is quite instructive about that. And for me, the Buddhist project is about bringing yourself and your experience more into harmony with reality and the way things are. And so while I appreciate that other people experienced some of Jeffrey's behavior as wrathful compassion, that isn't always how I experienced it or interpreted it. And I think it's also important to give voice to students who had a more difficult time with Jeffrey and who found him at times to be mean or worse than mean. And then I also want to add that a student who started in 2003, which is maybe the last or the next to last year that Jeffrey taught, said he found Jeffrey to be a kind of kindly grandfatherly type. So the important thing to me that I saw about traits that I consider not to be positive traits in Jeffrey is not to say he was a flawed person, but that one, he was a human being, and two, a human being who, as much as he could, tried to be aware of his shortcomings and to work on them. And so this was instructive for me because for me, this is kind of the foundation of the Buddhist project. And it's something that I try to do. And so Jeffrey was also a model for me in that way. Anyway, having said all this, I hope that I've gotten across how much I learned from Jeffrey and the deep and lasting influence he's had on my life, and how much I loved and valued him both as a mentor and later as a friend. Okay. So, and if this didn't land well, I apologize. Okay, so now, and so I didn't cut that down very much. It's a half hour, so I apologize. So now the actual reason you're all here today, I think, to hear something about Yoga Tantra and the compendium of reality. So I will share, oops. I'll share my screen and I will start the slideshow. Okay, and can you all see that now? Because I can only see the PowerPoint. I can't see anybody.
No, no, we can't see.
You cannot.
No, we can't see the PowerPoint.
Uh, hmm.
Okay, now we can see.
Now you can see it. Okay, great. Okay. And do you see it full screen now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, great. Okay. Okay. Oops. I suppose we should start from the beginning, not the end. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk very briefly about is this term Tantric Buddhism. Tantra used, like we say, Tantric Buddhism, is not used that way as a kind of general term for their tradition. So there is no equivalent of Tantric Buddhism in Indian, Tibetan, or Chinese traditions, as far as I know. The terms that are used are method or way or system of mantra. And this is used in distinction to method or way or system of the perfections. Later, method of secret mantra is used. Later, adamantine or vajra vehicle is used. And then secret mantra, adamantine or vajra vehicle, Sangha Dorje Tekpa is kind of the full term that they use in Tibetan traditions nowadays. Okay, so just we use Tantric Buddhism, and I think it's okay to use the term, but I also think it's maybe important to note that the traditions don't use the term this way. They do, yeah. And in East Asian Buddhism, in scholarship on East Asian Buddhism, English scholarship, they often use the term esoteric Buddhism rather than Tantric Buddhism, which is perhaps better, but I think it's fine to use Tantric Buddhism, but just wanted to mention this. So you do find that the word Tantra or the term Tantra in text titles. You find it in doxographical categories like Yoga Tantra, Yogini Tantra, Action Tantra, but it's never used for the system as a whole. So Tantra Yana, as far as I know, is never found. Okay. Okay, so a little bit about early development of Tantra before the text that we're going to look at. And I'm going to use these terms proto-Tantra and classical Tantra. These also are not terms used in the traditions, but I think they're maybe instructive, and so I'm going to use them. Okay. So there were various kind of practices that can be talked about as proto-tantra. They're usually for a specific purpose, like protection from snakes or rain, causing rain during a drought. They use incantations or spells like mantra and dharani. As they develop, there's an aspect of internal meditation that's added, visualization of deities. The deities are grouped into three families: the Tathagata or Buddha family, Lotus family, and Vajra family. And then about the middle of the 7th century, with the text, The Enlightenment of Vairochana Sutra, which is called a sutra, not a tantra, although it's considered a tantra, we get the appearance of kind of tantra texts in the human world. This particular text probably appeared first in North India and was associated, it seems, with Nalanda Monastery, middle of the 7th century. There are references to deity yoga, although they're very brief. And in chapter 1 of this text, there's a philosophical discourse on the nature of mind, which may connect it to Yogacara or Chittamatra mind-only developments. There is a shift from Shakyamuni as the Buddha figure at the head of the Buddha family to Vairochana at the head of that family. There's still a kind of organization into three Buddha families. And the mandalas and so forth and the way they relate to each other, the different mandalas are not fully systematized, although they're moving in that direction. Okay. And now we come to the Compendium of Reality of All Thus Gone Ones, which is the text and the title of today's talk. And this does have kind of fully developed and systematized structure and layout. And there are 5 Buddha families. The mandalas are well organized and consistent in terms of the names of the deities and the number of deities and the arrangement. This text also has 2 of the 3 seminal or foundational tantric narratives. And it has, as I mentioned, a clear 5 Buddha family structure. Okay, now when we look at the origin where this text appeared in the world, in the human world, probably in the last quarter of the 7th century, South India, and this comes from Chinese sources, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Chinese narratives tell of a monk in South India who figured out how to open the door of this iron stupa, and inside he found this text and other tantric texts. And Pudun, who's a 14th century Tibetan scholar, also relates a position in which 18 texts fell on the roof of an Indian king named Prakasha Chandra, who lived in South India also, it seems. This particular citation says he lived near Sri Parvata, which has been identified in South India near on the map where the rectangle is. And I think it's important to say a little bit more about these origin narratives. Now, these are not found in our text. This is the kind of 3rd major narrative, tantric narrative, after the 2 that, well, the deity of the narrative of Shakyamuni's enlightenment and the narrative of Vajrapani dueling it out and subjugating Maheshvara or Shiva. So this is the 3rd that does not appear in our text. And the reason these origin narratives are important is because if you think about it, these texts suddenly appear in the human world when they haven't been there before, very much like the Mahayana texts did when they appeared. And so there has to be an explanation of how these are actually authentic Buddhist texts and not just something that people made up, right? And so one of these narratives is that this iron stupa, another is text falling on the roof of a king. Now, these narratives are kind of explanations that are similar to the way the Mahayana Sutras origin is explained. For instance, it's said that Nagarjuna retrieved the 100,000 stanza Perfection of Wisdom Sutra from the Naga King's underwater palace, where it had been kept since it was taught first by Shakyamuni, so in those intervening centuries. And I think it's also similar to Tibetan Dharma texts, which is something that the Dalai Lama has said that they are similar to the Tantras, which seem to not appear immediately after the Buddha has taught them. So let's look a little bit at the narratives that we're going to, in the Compendium of Reality text. As I mentioned, it has two of the three central tantric narratives. One is the enlightenment narrative that we're going to look at in some detail. The second is the Maheshwara subjugation narrative, Vajrapani subduing Maheshwara at Vairochana's command. And this brings to the fore tantric deities in their wrathful aspects and the tantric doctrine of violence as a legitimate and sometimes necessary practice. Now, I think we're not going to have time to talk about that today, but it's also an important narrative. Okay. Let's look at the Enlightenment narrative that we find in the Compendium of Reality text. It says that the Bodhisattva, who's called Sarva-tathagata-tattva-samgraha, although this is the same person as Siddhartha, and in fact, the name Sarva-tathagata-tattva-samgraha is an alternate name that appears also in some of the Pali literature, so it's clear this is referring to the same person. He sits under the Bodhi tree, just as the stories that we're all probably familiar with, and he's determined to become enlightened. He enters the immovable meditative state, just as he does in the earlier stories. But here's where the story changes. All of the Buddhas gather, and the text says they completely fill this world like sesame seeds fill a sesame pod. And so I've included the picture because I never quite understood what the simile was saying, but I think sesame seeds completely fill a sesame pod. We see half of the sesame pod here. So we're talking about wall-to-wall Buddhas, basically. And they all the Buddhas display their complete enjoyment bodies for the Bodhisattva's benefit. And they ask him this question, and this is directly from the Tantra. O son of good lineage, how will you realize the unsurpassed, complete, and perfect enlightenment, you who endure all austerities without the knowledge of the reality of all thus gone ones? And in one of the explanatory tantras, yoga tantras, which comments or expounds on our text, the Compendium of Reality, it says that all the Buddhists snap their fingers at one time to kind of wake the Bodhisattva up. And so with this question, they rouse the Bodhisattva from this immovable meditative state. And the Bodhisattva prostrates to all the Buddhas, and he says this: O transcendent victor, thus gone ones, instruct me. What is the reality of all thus gone ones like? How do I practice? Okay. And in response, all the Buddhas together give instruction, and this is a 5-step practice. And I'm not going to go through the details, a few, but more about what the overall kind of structure is and why it's important. So the first meditation instruction they give him is to, the text says, penetrate and set in equipoise on your mind, which the commentarial traditions say means to meditate on the nature of your mind. And then they give him a mantra to repeat while he's doing that. And after he does the practice, he reports to all of the Buddhas what his experience is like, his internal experience. And then this is the basis later for practitioners to do the practice. Okay. So he reports his experience, and the commentarial traditions call this process the 5 enlightenments or the 5 awakenings. And the traditions associate each of these awakenings or enlightenments with one of the 5 Buddha wisdoms and one of the 5 Buddha families. Now, in the fourth step, all the Buddhists bestow initiation on the Bodhisattva with the name initiation, and so there's initiation involved. And at the end of this five-step process, the Bodhisattva is now fully enlightened. Although in the text, there are then additional things that are done, practices to stabilize various aspects of his enlightenment and things like that. So he is enlightened, but there's still somehow some more things to do. Okay, so what is innovative and important about this process? Ritual in this process, ritual has become central to the soteriological project of becoming enlightened, the Buddhist project, right? There's the transmission of instructions, is an initiation, there's a clearly defined multi-stage practice that combines meditation on the nature of the mind, development of that, deity yoga, this process of deity yoga and deconstructing one's identity as an unenlightened being, cultivating the intention to become enlightened, various visualizations, mantra repetition, and all of these things cultivate or culminate in the Bodhisattva reconstructing his identity as an awakened being, as a Buddha. There's a communal aspect to enlightenment, which we don't see in the earlier narrative of Shakyamuni's awakening experience. The Bodhisattva is not alone under the Bodhi tree. All the Buddhas are there, and they are acting as teachers. And this kind of indicates that in tantric practice, teachers have to be involved. And this process is interactional or interpersonal. There is this back and forth with the guru, direct instruction, reporting back experience, receiving further instructions. And so a little bit more about deity yoga. This practice mimics the state of a Buddha, because a Buddha's mind, they say, is absorbed in reality. And then from that, through the cultivation of the intention to become enlightened in order to benefit others, physical forms, the form bodies, arise. And that is what is happening in this practice of deity yoga. The first step involves meditating on the nature of one's mind. And so, as I mentioned, there seems to be some connection with Yogacara or with Chittamatra, and maybe, yeah. There was also in the earlier Tantra, in terms of tantric development in India, the enlightenment of Vairochana Tantra. Chapter 1 was a discourse on the nature of the mind, so there is continuity with that. The mind is described as being naturally luminous, and so here, sorry, I'm good ahead in the slide. There is this possible connection with Yogacara, and it may be useful here to think about George Dreyfus's distinction that he made in his talk between Yogacharans and Chittamatrans. The distinction being, although both refute the existence of external objects, Chittamatrans do hold that the mind or consciousness has some kind of true existence. Okay, and so where this falls in that, I don't know. And so in the commentaries on the nature of the mind, Shakyamitra is an 8th century Indian commentator and who wrote the text that Dalai Lama suggested I read. In his commentary on this part of the Tantra, he cites Vasubandhu's famous refutation of partless particles from Vasubandhu's 20 stanzas, and then Shakyamitra goes on to draw the conclusion that there are no external objects, and then he goes on to state that the three worlds are mind only. Now, in terms of George's kind of differentiation of Yogacharans and Chittamatrans, which, as George said, was one that he used. I believe George said it's a differentiation he uses, but it's not found in the traditions. I don't know where this falls, but it's interesting to keep that in mind. Yeah. Now, why is this such a big deal, this narrative? What are the kind of ramifications of this? First, it's a self-conscious statement of Tantric Buddhism's difference from all previous forms of Buddhism, and this includes from previous forms of Mahayana Buddhism. The Buddha's enlightenment, according to this narrative, didn't occur the way we have been told it occurs, right? That narrative where the Bodhisattva sat under the tree and entered the immovable meditative state and had his awakened experience, that narrative, according to our text here, is wrong. And so this is a statement that this tantric narrative, which involves deity yoga, is telling the true story of Shakyamuni's enlightenment. And so it is putting forth a new paradigm for Buddhist practice, which is a big claim to make. It's a big deal. So this is something new, the text is saying. Deity yoga is both authentic Mahayana Buddhist practice, and it is different from all previous Mahayana practices. And it is, in fact, how all the previous Buddhas became enlightened, because they've all gathered and they're telling him, hey, how are you going to do this? Okay. So this implies that this practice is the only way to become enlightened, since it's the way that all Buddhas have become enlightened. And that this is the reality or of all Buddhas that we find in the title of this text, the Compendium of Reality of All Buddhas. And this is the reality that in the question, when they all gather in front of the Bodhisattva, they ask him, how will you become enlightened without realizing the reality of all Buddhas? And so without that realization, this narrative is saying there is no enlightenment. And so this is why all the Buddhas gather in front of the Bodhisattva, rouse him from his meditative state, and ask him how he thinks he'll become enlightened without doing this practice and without having this realization of the reality of all the Buddhas. It is a rhetorical question that they're asking. And they are basically saying, hey, boy, what do you think you're doing here? Now, when I read this passage with Jeffrey, and we read it as it was quoted in a text by Pudun, a 14th century Tibetan scholar, Jeffrey said, Steve, this is shocking. This is a 10th ground bodhisattva, and he doesn't know what he's doing. And so Jeffrey really drew my attention to this. And it took me many, many years to start to try to flesh out some of the implications, which I hope I've communicated here today. Okay. Now, this presentation of deity yoga, it is not the first mention of deity yoga in a Tantra text, but it is, in my judgment, the clearest and the most detailed. It is, to me, clear enough that you could actually do the practice from reading the Tantra. Now, generally, they say that you can't understand the Tantras by reading them yourself, by yourself, because intentionally, Tantras have omissions, they have mixed up order, they have coded language, and all this is done so that you have to have a qualified student instruct you. But in this case, this seems not to follow that. And I think you have to have some idea what it means to meditate on the nature of your own mind. But otherwise, it is clear enough and detailed enough to actually do the practice, which is also a bit shocking. And when you read around in other tantras, it's rarely this clear or this kind of complete. We're talking a little bit more about deity yoga and Tsongkhapa. He said that deity yoga was the distinguishing feature of Tantra. And the reason, and so he says this causes some difficulties for him because in some of the Tantras, there is no mention of deity yoga. And so he has to explain, if this is the distinguishing feature, how is it that it doesn't appear in some Tantras? And the way he does it is by saying, well, those Tantras in which it does not appear, deity yoga does not appear, these are Tantras that are not for the main intended trainees of that class or type of Tantra. But the Tantras that are for the main intended trainees of that type of Tantra or that class of Tantra do have deity yoga. And so Tsongkhapa was aware that this was a kind of problematic assertion to make, and that's how he handled that difficulty. Okay. Okay. Now, a little bit more about Tsongkhapa. He spent a year studying Yoga Tantra, and this is from Gareth Sparham's research, which he kindly shared with me. He wrote a book on, Gareth wrote a book on Tsongkhapa's presentation of Tantric ethics, which Gareth called Tantric Ethics, and in it he explains not only did Tsongkhapa spend a year studying Yoga Tantra, but he used one of the explanatory Yoga Tantras, the section on pledges and vows, to write his section on the pledges and vows for the three lower Tantra sects. Okay. And there is a quote in Shaktimitra, which I have not been able to locate the exact quote, but I'm certain that I've seen it, where he says, deity yoga is necessary to become a Buddha because a cause must be similar to its effect. And so in deity yoga, because you're mimicking the state of a Buddha, mind absorbed in reality, and then from that form body is arising, because deity yoga mimics that, it is a cause that is similar to the effect, which is Buddhahood. Okay. There was a discussion I had with Jeffrey, which those of you who did the class with him on deity yoga in Action Tantra, using the process, following the process of the 6 deities. I will skip that for now, but perhaps if there is time in the questions, we could come back to that. So to summarize, this narrative is a self-conscious representation of Tantric Buddhism, of Tantra, as something new and different and unique, and yet still authentic and essential to the practice or the project, the Buddhist project of awakening or seeking enlightenment. And I will read a kind of short summary that I've written about the compendium of reality. So this text stands as perhaps the most significant single development in the history of Indian Buddhist Tantra. It combines a variety of elements, some of which developed out of earlier non-tantric Mahayana traditions, some of which are found in earlier Tantra texts, and some of which occur for the first time in this text, the Compendium of Reality. Among the innovative features are a clear presentation of deity yoga, the structuring of mandalas around 5 Buddha families rather than around 3 Buddha families, the identity of the central Buddha figure being now Vairochana, and this was prefigured in the Enlightenment of Vairochana Tantra, which preceded it historically. In addition, the Compendium of Reality contains 2 of the 3 central and detailed tantric narratives in which ritual processes are interwoven and which reflect the earliest emergence of a self-conscious tantric identity. And so I couldn't see you all. I thank you for your patience. I don't know, I am not skilled enough to be able to do the PowerPoint and still see the Zoom screen. So I don't know if anyone's still awake, but I thank you for your patience. And if there are questions, please, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
It was actually wonderful, Professor Weinberger. Really, really wonderful. First of all, I'd like to say, nice to hear the other side of Gen Jeffrey. We experienced a very compassionate, loving side in terms of his relationship with Lori and all the stuff that she was going through with her brain surgeries. And they became quite close, and he gave her a lot of time and a lot of care, and they mutually, kind of helped each other in some ways. But I really want to say that we experienced that very gentle side of Gen Jeffrey too. He was very direct with me, and I'm used to that, having dealt with geshes, half of my life, who were all very direct with me. And I think that that's in some ways part of the tradition. But I did want to say thank you for sharing that other human side, compassionate side of Genla. And I know he cared about you so much and respected you so much, and talked about you all the time. And I just want to say thank you for everything that you've done for Uma, for him, and just over the years, just as a friend, and also allowing him to be a mentor and, working with him on these things. I guess a question that I have so we have this huge emphasis on action tantra in the broader sense of, the community of Buddhists around, a really heavy emphasis, it seems, on action tantra, and then highest yoga tantra. And then even in the writings, it seems that it's heavily weighted on both of those sides from the resources that we see as Westerners. Is there a reason for this? Did Tsongkhapa after that year say, oh, I'll make this section kind of doesn't need to be as large? What was it? Is there a historical time where there was more emphasis on it? What is your thinking behind why so much emphasis on the action tantra and then highest yoga tantra? Is it because there's so much carryover, as you were saying, because there was carry from yoga tantra into the action and performance tantras? Was there so much carryover there wasn't as much necessity? What is your thinking around this?
That's a good question. Thank you, Jeff. I think at least at one time, especially during the 8th century, when really Buddhism was being transmitted to Tibet kind of on a large scale for the first time, this was kind of the latest thing in India. And so it was quite important then. And then there's the period after the collapse of the Tibetan Empire, where it's a little hard to know what was going on. But certainly it seems a lot of these kind of lineages or traditions that would be classified later as Nyingma traditions were still active. And then the period at the beginning of the second diffusion of Buddhism, that technically, or not technically, but often is said to start with the translator Rinchen Songbo. When Yeshe in King in Western Tibet sends a certain number of young Tibetans to India to translate and bring back kind of cleaner tantras, and included in those again are the compendium of reality, and so I think they were still important then, and they seem to have continued to have an important role in Tibet Jade Tsongkhapa wrote about them. The eighth Karmapa wrote a 4-volume text on Yoga Tantra. And some of the practices still continue. One of those that continues is a funeral practice from the Sarva-tathagata-tattva-samgraha, or the purification of all bad migrations Tantra, which is also in the Yoga Tantra family. And so there's kind of that lasting effect. Now, in terms of its relationship, say, to highest Yoga Tantra, as later developments came, they certainly displaced kind of, in large part, Yoga Tantra, but Yoga Tantra continued to have some influence and seems to have still been important in kind of the education of Tibetan lamas. The relationship with Action Tantra, I don't know. Yeah, so I'm not sure if I've answered your question, Jeff, or if you've heard me. I don't know if my internet is wobbling here.
No, absolutely. Could hear you.
Okay.
Great.
Okay.
Great. Appreciate it. I've just been curious about that. Why so much emphasis on the beginning and the end? Was it that everybody wants the highest thing? So as soon as they had the highest thing, let's focus on what that is, because that's called highest. It's just interesting.
Yes.
Just curious.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Yeah. Later, how it kind of is eclipsed by yeah, Mahayoga, Yogini Tantras, highest Yoga Tantras. Yeah, I think so. But it does seem to kind of remain important, and there were monasteries assigned to still do the practices. And in the Sakya school, it has continued. There's a tradition in Drikung Kagyu. They do practices from the Sarva-tathagata-tattva-samgraha, from the purification of all bad migrations. Yeah, yes. In Gelug, they also do practices from that tantra. I think Labrang Tashi Keel was one center of the practices from the purification of all bad migrations tantra. Yeah. They call Gunrik Nambarnanse, Sarva Vid Vairochana, or All Knowing Vairochana is the central deity there. So another version of Vairochana.
Thank you very much. And I guess one other question. When we read a lot of the Tantras, and His Holiness the Dalai Lama always mentions that the Yogacara school is something so important that carries over into it. Now, with that being said, there's obviously a difference between there's no external world and there is an external world. This is a very different assertion. No matter if we're looking at strict mind-only Chitta Mantra or moving it over into Yogacara Svatantrika, no externality versus externality is a different assertion. Full stop, different assertion. So do you see that it's a helpful tool, or are the Tantras asserting more like a Yogacara system that needs the Prasangika view of, you see what I'm trying to get at, added to it? And because it seems like a lot of them read in this manner. So I was just curious if your thought on that. Is it like the third turning of the wheel of Dharma, where the Prasangika school says that's interpretive, and the second turning of the wheel is the definitive, and we have to add the emptiness of inherent existence to the Buddha nature to understand what the natural Buddha nature is? Is it like that, is my question.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a way to, maybe my internet connection. I don't know if you can still hear me.
Yes, I can hear you. You froze
Okay.
for a moment,
Okay.
but
Yeah.
definitely hear you.
Yeah, sorry, my apologies for that. Maybe I'll turn off my video and that will take up less bandwidth for a few minutes anyway. Yeah, this is a great question, and I don't really know. I think it's an area for research that I think is an interesting area. Um, I think talking about the nature of the mind being Rangshingi Usawa, being um, Prakriti Prabhasra, being naturally luminous. There may be connections with the Tathagata or Buddha nature kind of strands that develop. Casey Forbes gave a talk in the Zadra series on Buddha nature that her talk focused on this natural luminous, the mind being naturally luminous. So I don't think it's an accident that that's in there. What that connection is, what that means, how they interpreted that when it said after you kind of investigate or penetrate your own mind, and the Buddhas say to the Bodhisattva, and now, because the nature of the mind is naturally luminous, then you do these other things. I don't know. I've tried. Shakyamitra's commentary seems to he quotes from the Vasubandhu's 20 stanzas and the famous refutation of partless particles, and then goes on to say, therefore, no external objects. And then he says in another place, the three worlds are mind only. But I don't know exactly what his position is. I don't know if it fits in neatly to, the categories as they are kind of delimited now. I don't know. I've always found it somewhat odd that I think even in contemporary Gelugpa traditions, they say, well, in order to practice Tantra, you need to have either the mind only or the prasangika view. And it just seemed like such an odd thing because they're so strict about, and so like I guess strict that prasangika is the only actual view, and without that you're not gonna you're not getting enlightened without prasangika view. So to say, well, you can practice mind only with some other view, it never made sense to me how they reconcile those two positions. So I don't know. Yeah. So you've asked an excellent question and just exposed more of what I don't know. But
Yeah, it's just a question I've had. Even in Tsongkhapa's Illuminating the Intent, there's a talk of a direct perception of the mind only view, something like this, of lack of externality. And I just don't know how you can have a valid cognition of something that isn't, if there is externality, I don't know, I haven't had this realization, but if there is externality, how can you validly cognize something that doesn't exist to exist? The lack of externality. So I've just always been curious about this. Okay, let's move on. We've got some questions from the attendees. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. Could you please say more on the implication of Jason Kappa's statement about deity yoga being the distinguishing factor of Tantra?
Well, I mean, he lists several things that are kind of features of Tantra, but he says, and this is, the place to look for this is Jeffrey's book called The Tantric Distinction, where he lays this out, I think, pretty clearly, that this is the single distinguishing feature of Tantra. And he makes a statement about the cause has to be a similitude of the effect, I think is how Jeffrey translates it. I always just took it as meaning similar to the effect, but yeah, and I don't think he cites an Indian position that he's basing that on. And so it seems like maybe, and if I can find this quote, it would be good, from Shakyamitra. It seemed to me like, oh, maybe this is where that actually came from, or something he was thinking about, that Jay was thinking about, because he did study yoga, spend a year studying yoga tantra, so I think he was quite familiar with these materials. And His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, has also studied these in the teachings that he gave to Jeffrey on yoga tantra, which I think are in that Jeffrey's yoga tantra book. it includes the oral teachings from His Holiness, and he's familiar with all these materials also, it seems. But so I don't really have more to say about that. Yeah, I'm sorry, that's probably not a very helpful answer.
Thank you. I've also heard distinguishments like the four purities, differentiating Tantra from Sutra and so forth. Does this narrative of Shakyamuni Buddha's enlightenment contradict the Mahayana view that he was enlightened before manifesting as an ordinary being born to Queen Maya? Is this addressed in Tantra?
It is addressed in Tantra. And so there are three main Indian Yoga Tantra authors or commentators. One is Shakyamitra. He was chronologically the middle one in the 8th century. The earliest was Buddha-Guya, who also wrote commentaries on the concentration continuation Tantra, presenting the deity yoga process that uses the 6 deities, which I think some of you have studied with Jeffrey. And then the last was Anandagarbha, who was probably late 8th century. And between Anandagarbha and Shakyamitra, one of them holds that he was a 10th ground bodhisattva who took rebirth, and one of them holds that he was a fully realized Buddha who just made a display of taking rebirth as the son of Shuddhodana. And I don't remember which Shakyamitra holds, which position Shakyamitra holds and which Buddha-Guya holds, but I know one holds one position and the other holds the other. And so it does seem to be consistent with that, also that kind of position that he was making a display. Yeah. And I don't, that's as much as I think I know about that, so I couldn't really say more about it.
Before we close, unless there's more questions that come in, could you talk a little bit about the 6 deities? It's such a beautiful topic, just maybe a few minutes, or just talk a little bit about the 6 deities.
Yeah, I'm not sure more about what they are or more about how that relates to my claim that this presentation that we find of the 5 clear enlightenments, or the 5 enlightenments, or the 5 awakenings, is the first clear and detailed presentation in a Tantra text.
I just think, because I think Lama Tsongkhapa says that apply this 6 deity process to all the classes. Even in highest yoga tantra, we would apply this process. And I think many people may not have heard of it. And if it's too much for the next few minutes, then I totally get it, because it is a lot. But you said, hey, maybe we could talk about that. So I was just seeing if you wanted to maybe just mention what it is, and just because I think a lot of people, folk don't know how you would make how does this, okay, now I become a deity. How does this construction project happen?
Yeah.
And I think it may be helpful to talk about the construction project.
Yeah, and I think of it as a deconstruction and then reconstruction project. Deconstruction first being the emptiness part, however that's conceived, to kind of break down your identity as an unawakened being. And then the reconstruction process is out of that realization of emptiness, or the nature of mind, then developing it through stages into the full kind of body of a Buddha with the marks and signs and so forth. And I think maybe it's a great question. I remember what the 6 deities are, or at least their names. And I remember that there are, I think, the 4 concentrations that kind of dovetailed with the 6 deity practice, but I don't remember the details, so I don't feel qualified to go in, to speak about those details. I will say that I did have this kind of friendly argument with Jeffrey because he had translated Buddha Guya's commentary on the concentration continuation tantra, which lays out the 6 deities in detail, which I think is in the Tantric Techniques book or the Deity Yoga book, one of the two. And so when I said this is the first clear presentation, clear and detailed presentation in a Tantra text of Deity Yoga, Jeffrey said, well, hey, Buddha Guya says, okay, it's not in the concentration continuation Tantra itself, because that only says flow to the bases, mind and sound, right? Which, and I said, who the hell knows what that means, right? That's not detailed to me. And Jeffrey said, well, Buddha Guya says, look, the concentration continuation Tantra is related to or is a continuation of the Vajrayana Tantra. And Buddha Guya says in the Vajrayana Tantra, it clearly talks about all this. So that's why it's not in the concentration continuation Tantra, because it's already in this other text that it's related to, that it clearly talks about the 6 deities. Now, and so Jeffrey said, well, Steve, are you saying Buddha Guya made this up? And I said, no, I'm not saying he made this up, Jeffrey. What I'm saying is the Vajrayana does not exist. It doesn't exist in Chinese, Tibetan, or Sanskrit. And so we don't have the text. So the Tantra text that we have, this is the first clear and detailed presentation of Deity Yoga. Now, it seems a little bit suspect to me that Buddha Guya didn't quote from the Vajrayana Tantra instead of just saying, oh, it's there, and it's very clear there. So because they quote so much from texts when they're talking about them, I would have kind of expected him to put the quote in. But that doesn't, my position is not, well, Buddha Guya is either lying or making it up. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm just saying, of the Tantra text that we have today, this is the first clear and detailed presentation of how to do Deity Yoga, this practice of deconstructing our normal identity and reconstructing ourselves as awakened beings. Yeah.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Weinberger. We really appreciate you. Thank you for your work in this area. Thank you for your talk. Thank you for everything. This has been a very meaningful experience for me. This is the last of the Legacy series, and I hope it's been for all of you as well. At the end of his life, Ken Hopkins said something like, I'm not afraid of dying. I've done this so many times. I'll just miss the friends I've made in this life. And I know that you were one of the very good friends that he was referring to. So thank you. You're all amazing. I'm so grateful to all the esteemed speakers. We truly honored Genla throughout these 11 sessions. The real honoring is by applying these concepts in our daily lives, allowing for a transformative cognitive change to occur by upgrading our discrimination of things. I'd like to circle back to the scholar who kicked off the series, Professor Donald Lopez, and read 2 stanzas from the introduction arranged in the verse from the beginning of his beautiful translation of Janja Rilpi Dorje's Tenets, Beautiful Adornment of Mount Meru. The introduction arranged in verse. In the deep canyon of existence, with its 100 million hardships, it is the nature of most of us to have a worried mind. What method liberates us from this? What is not the method? To ponder this again and again is the best deed we can do. It's so wonderful that we have all had the chance to hear a variety of views and explanations about reality. It's our responsibility to discover the truth for ourselves. No one can do this for us. Even Lord Buddha stated, just as a goldsmith tests gold by rubbing, burning, and cutting before buying it, so too you should examine my words before accepting them, and not just out of respect for me. These teachings were given by Buddha Shakyamuni out of great compassion to stop the unnecessary sufferings we are forced into again and again due to misperceiving reality. I hope this series has helped to put a dent somewhere in that iron net of ignorance that we can all be free from. A big, huge thank you to all the incredible speakers. Your lectures have all been very thought-provoking and beneficial to anyone who is ready to tear samsara to pieces. Thank you to Sravasti Abbey for working so hard. Thank you, Venerable Children, for being such a guiding light in a sometimes very dark world. May your activities continue to have no boundaries. Thank you to everyone for your incredible questions and patient listening. May we have the merit to continue to hear the truth of suchness in this and all of our lives until the seed of perfection ripens within all of us. Now let's dedicate all the immense virtue, merit we've created from listening to these pure teachings from the King of Prayers. I dedicate all this virtue to emulate the knowledge of the hero Manjushri and likewise Samantabhadra as well. With whatever dedication is praised as supreme by all the conquerors who traverse the three times, I also dedicate all my roots of virtue for the sake of auspicious deeds. And a prayer for the long life of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the wish-fulfilling jewel in our world, Lord Chenrezig in person. In the heavenly realm of Tibet, surrounded by a chain of snow mountains, you are the source of all benefit and happiness for beings, all-powerful. Avalokiteshvara, Chenrezig, please remain until samsara ends. Happy trails, everyone!